Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Series. In this second volume focused on development plans, we're talking about a topic that's as vital as it is complex: identifying needs and priorities. Development planning is more than filling out forms or setting arbitrary goals. It's about intentional alignment between people and purpose, strategy and execution, and individual potential and organizational direction. In growing businesses, particularly those under 400 employees, and more likely the sweet spot 50 to about 200, the difference between reactive planning and intentional development often shows up in engagement, performance, and long-term viability. Now, this conversation will look a little different for every organization. Needs and priorities vary. What we'll explore today are universal principles and practical tools that you can use to shape growth at both the leadership level and the front lines. Now, let's begin with the simple truth. Not all gaps are created equal. Some gaps are deficit-based, problems that need fixing, misalignments that are hurting performance, or weaknesses that are creating drag. But others are aspirational, the kind of gaps that exist between where you are and where you want to be. And these are the opportunities for growth, innovation, or transformation. Both deficit and aspirational gaps represent a challenge to solve, and that's where the problem-solving mindset becomes critical. It also applies to development plans because development plans are there to close gaps. A problem-solving model that I'm going to give you right now should be familiar, but I've added a sixth step. You may have seen it with six, but typically it's a five-step problem-solving model, and it's pretty universal. I think as an organization, you'll want to make sure the language lines up with how you want to say things, but you want to have best practices around using it so that all teams have a common language and that people are approaching it the same way and you're not having avoidable mistakes. So the first step is to clearly define the problem. Make it specific and measurable and meaningful. Einstein said if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about it and only 5 minutes talking about the solution. In other words, he would spend the time on the problem definition. The second step is identify root causes. Go deeper than symptoms. Tools like the 5 whys or fishbone diagrams, quality tools, these will help here. The third step is generate options, create space for open thinking before evaluating, brainstorming, and it can take on different forms. But the point is you want to make sure you get everything out on the table. And sometimes you might have a different group in these meetings than you do in the next meeting, step 4, which is evaluate and select. Use clear criteria aligned with your strategy. You may have different people in these meetings. There may be overlap. But the point is, it's art and science together. You want to look at both of those. And then the fifth step is implement and monitor. Assign ownership and accountability, including a plan for metrics. You want to decide what the metrics are going to be before you get started on the solution. We don't want the goalposts moving. And this is not about just solving today's problem. It's about creating a culture that follows a solid methodology and can repeat that methodology. And it's plug and play. Any team can step in at any point because they understand it. These are things that are important, but often we don't take time to do. It's like draining the swamp versus fighting the alligators. No one's really asking you about draining the swamp, but there's plenty of people asking you for, to meet deadlines and pay bills and these things that get to the fighting alligators. The sixth step, the one I said I like to add, is reflect and adjust. Because in business, nothing ever works exactly as planned. We need to keep learning. I like to say no plan survives contact with reality. So we have to have a way of learning from what took place and getting better for the next time. So this model should be second nature to every leader, as I alluded to, and with common intentional language for your organization, ideally to every team, because there will always be another goal, another crisis, another missed opportunity. A shared approach to problem solving builds confidence and competency and allows for autonomy and capability across your organization. Next, I want to layer in an important distinction: business model versus operating model. So your business model answers the big picture questions. What value do we deliver? To whom? And how do we generate revenue and stay competitive? Your operating model, on the other hand, defines how you organize your resources, roles, and workflows to make the business model come to life day in and day out. One may evolve over a decade, the other might change quarterly. Both models matter. When you're designing development plans, you have to consider these two, the operating model and the business model. But neither of them exist in a vacuum. To really ground development efforts, we have to start with your vision and mission. Your vision is your long-term aspiration, the future state that your business exists to create. Your mission is your purpose, or like the purpose, the reason that your company exists and how it's going to get there. These must be clearly articulated and widely shared across your company. Without that clarity, even your best development plans may drift off course. I want to emphasize the importance of this because when a company gets to the point where they are told that they have to have a board for governance reasons, maybe it's investors, maybe there's partners that they brought on or what have you, but when that board is in place, they are going to push for the vision and the mission statements. They want those articulated and they want them real. It's not just a paperwork exercise, because that's what the board is governing, using for governance, using for their leadership support, etc. So just because nobody's asking you for it doesn't mean it's not important. As the owner, you are sometimes going to have to wear that board hat. Vision and the mission, they must be clearly articulated and widely shared across the company. Without that clarity, even your best development plans may drift off course. Vision and mission create the why behind the how. From there, strategy and tactics guide execution. Strategy defines your high-level approach. Tactics are the ground game. The cascade from vision to tactics creates the foundation for your business and operating models. And those in turn inform how you identify individual and team development priorities. Seen from this perspective, I'm creating context to devote resources, at least time, to thinking about crafting development plans. There are always alligators to worry about. They'll always be there to fight with. Spending some time on draining the swamp will make it easier to win those battles in the future. One of the most powerful metaphors I use is the team metaphor. And I'm talking about describing the workplace. Unlike family or command and control models, a team-based approach helps clarify how performance is evaluated, why some people are promoted and others aren't, what it means to contribute meaningfully, why development is a non-negotiable, not optional. If you don't have this framed out, leaders will often start winging it. When asked why somebody got promoted and they did not, you'll often find that they're just shooting from the hip. And that becomes a problem. And a lot of times when managers are under pressure, they resort to what they learned from their past role, their conditioning kicks in, maybe what was rewarded before, maybe what's worked before. So this kind of an approach, it helps prevent managers, like I said, from winging it when answering why something is done. Winging it will often come from their conditioning, but it's not what we need today in the organization moving forward. A team metaphor sets the table for a playbook and development plans to execute those plays flawlessly. In business, we don't face external defenders like in sports. Our resistance comes from internal inefficiencies, unaligned incentives, protective reflexes, and cultural inertia. That's the real opponent. And we have far more control over it than we may want to admit. Of course, when we admit it, then we have to do something about it. So I get it. This makes flawless execution much easier than, say, on a football team facing a worthy opponent, because there's no one facing us with intensity and direct focus to stop our plays. We do have the internal resistance we have to overcome. We do have to have the inertia that has to be overcome. We do have to have overcome the normal resistance in the marketplace. But we don't have that defender who's literally trying to disrupt the plays. They don't even know our plays. Finally, everything we'll talk about today aligns with principles from self-determination theory. Building environments where people thrive because they feel a sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. You'll see that come through in today's 3 focus areas. Onboarding as a foundation for development, not a checklist. when we think about onboarding, oftentimes people think about two themes. One that is required either because your legal department is telling you to, or because there are regulations that require it. The other theme that may come up is just navigating where the supplies are kept. How do you navigate? What time do you come in? How's lunch handle? All these things, breaks, and where the widgets are. So those two themes come up, and they're usually covered because they have to be. There's immediate pain if they're not. But if you consider a sports team, the regulatory part of it, that's like knowing the rules of the game. So that part is known. They may review them periodically, but they're not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm not suggesting we don't do that in work, but I'm making the point there's three pillars of this onboarding. It's not just the two. And then, of course, the other one is navigating and finding their way around where the facilities are, the training room, and those kinds of things. Having the three pillars, the sports team, they're going to focus on is running the plays, seamlessly working together, making sure that everybody understands their role in a given play. Drilling, because we want it at the nervous system memory level, like muscle memory, but I call it nervous system memory because that's really what it is. The muscle doesn't have the memory. It may have the strength, but the nervous system firing, through the use of myelin, getting more and more active. The second thing is the feedback that builds intrinsic motivation, not just performance compliance. Intrinsic motivation is a big part of this. Otherwise, you're relying on incentives and external motivation. And then self-regulation and higher order thinking by leaders when crafting and implementing development plans. So we'll talk about those three: onboarding, feedback, and then the leaders' self-regulation so that they can operate in higher order thinking. So we'll also look at 4 domains that benefit from standardization, because assuming that people will just figure it out often leads to misalignment, stagnation, or conflict. And a lot of times the leader will have to wear all of these hats, but it's the different roles that the leader has. And then when you start adding your leadership team in place, you already have played out with that hat. Development plans shouldn't just live in HR documents. They should live in conversations, practices, and shared commitments across the company. By tying them to your business model, operating model, and mission-driven direction, you create an environment where growth is not just possible, it becomes inevitable. It becomes expected. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the onboarding. I already mentioned how there's 2 pillars that come up quite often, and that's the regulatory or the regulations and rules, and then what the legal department tells us or that our attorneys tell us just to keep us out of trouble. And along with that might go some accounting, whatever. The point is that neither of those are talking about how to be at your best, how to perform at your best, how to be a player on this team. In talking about onboarding, I'm recommending a business meeting that happens. But this business meeting is not about business, it's about them. This meeting will happen early on. You should not be talking about work in this meeting. I'm not saying you don't have other meetings to talk about work. You may have some urgent things that have to be taken care of. But this meeting is about the employee, and you want to set it up that way, and you want to make sure that you're fully present. If you have to do the meeting early in the morning so that you're fully present and there's no distractions, whatever it takes, you do not want to introduce business into this meeting. And there's a very good reason why. It is about business, but it's about them. This is a chance for the captain to stop steering the boat long enough to listen about where the crew wants to go, and then you can take that into consideration. So in this meeting, there's some things that are going to come out of it. One is you're going to create some psychological safety. That psychological safety is important. I talk a lot about people getting triggered and how we have to create some space so the stimulus response cycle doesn't send us automatically into fight or flight. The subconscious is biased towards looking for threats. The unfamiliar is seen as a threat. What we want to do is create some psychological safety so they have some references that just because they made a mistake, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a problem. I know of employees who thought one mistake that they were going to get fired. I know of employees who forged signatures because they were so worried about getting in trouble, and then they lose their job for forging the signature. It's people get into fight or flight and they use bad judgment. So having that psychological safety is like a buffer so that you can keep people from falling into that trap. You're going to, as a leader, you're going to model vulnerability. Now, this is not as deep as it sounds. What we're talking about here, we want to avoid folks falling into the child-parent, and we don't want to fall into the parent-child. It's very, very easy in the workplace for a leader to fall into that parent-child mode. It's very easy for the employee to fall into the child-parent, and neither one of those are going to be healthy. In the parent mode, right? All the answers, I have all the answers, and I get to judge, and it's my way or the highway. And in the child mode, I'm one step away from being criticized. I'm walking around on eggshells. I hope I'm right. I better find out what they want before I make a decision. I don't have freedom of action. So we don't want to do that. And so one of the ways we're going to model that vulnerability, this meeting, because we're not talking about business, we're talking about them. You won't know everything, and you can say, I don't know. Tell me more about that. I'd like to learn more about that. It's modeling this idea that, hey, I'm not perfect. I don't have all the answers. I'm not the parent. We are in a business relationship. Of course, it aligns with self-determination theory. Self-determination theory and the three pillars, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, is actually the underpinning for all of dynamic leadership, because intrinsic motivation far outperforms, or in terms of results, far outperforms extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation requires a lot of hands-on. Not only does the intrinsic motivation provide more motivation, but in terms of a development plan, it's very natural. It's a very natural fit for them to continue scaling up. From the multipliers, we want to be multipliers. We want to establish being a multiplier, not a diminisher. In the context of this onboarding meeting, you want to explore their strengths. People need to be seen. And so you're going to be exploring their strengths. You're going to uncover their special potential, if you will, their superpower, because those can then come into play when you need somebody. Like I always say, there's another crisis coming. We don't know when, we don't know how big, in what context, but there's always going to be another crisis. You know, if you look at the idea of 100-year anything, whether it's a flood or fire or whatever, these 100-year things exist. They're called 100-year because the likelihood of them happening is 1%. So theoretically, over 100 in a given year. So theoretically, over 100 years, you would see this thing happen one time. But there could be hundreds of 100-year events, meaning we could have in any given year, we could have 1, 2, 3, 4, or none 100-year events occur. So just something to think about. Then we have growth mindset. And the growth mindset it's not just having a growth mindset. People get lost in this. They think, oh, I have a growth mindset because I'm into personal development. And they don't realize that most of their vernacular has to do with a fixed mindset. Not only can a person have a growth mindset in one area and a fixed mindset in another, they can be triggered into a fixed mindset in an instant just because of something happened. They get triggered. Once a person goes into that fight or flight, once there's cortisol flowing and adrenaline flowing, the likelihood of them falling into a fixed mindset is pretty high. And then once they're in a fixed mindset, it's difficult for them to be able to interact. So they, as a leader, you as a leader, want to understand when you're falling into a growth mindset, and that's going to come in when we talk about self-regulation. But also, we want to use language that helps the employee stay in a growth mindset, and you're learning how the employee communicates. One of the things I like about this particular onboarding meeting is that you get a chance to calibrate how they are in a non-threatening environment, and then you can use that calibration to notice when they are becoming threatened. Because a person who's threatened, if you don't catch it early enough, like I said, the cortisol starts happening, and now it becomes a neurobiological event, and it's not something you can just, whisk away with words. It takes time. But if you can stop it from happening, you can do that with words. So calibrating when do they slip into a fixed mindset? What do they have a fixed mindset about? What do they sound like when they're in growth mindset mode? 20-mile march is from great by choice. And it talks about on the good days, you stick to the plan. You don't work extra hard on the good days. And then on the bad days, you work less. In the 20-mile march, the idea was they had to do 20 miles every single day as a South Pole expedition. 20 miles every single day, no matter what. Blizzards, And then when weather was good, you still did the 20 miles. And that's the attitude that you have. And they compared it to another team that did the other. They overdid it on the good days, and then they kind of stayed in on the bad days, the blizzards, etc. And they outperformed them. I mean, they beat their time by, if I recall, more than 30 or 40% faster than that other team. And then return on luck. This is also from Great by Choice. And the luck is like preparation meeting with opportunity, right? But when you understand the strengths of your employees and your team members, their special interests, there's opportunity there. And there's going to be alignment sometimes between what the employee loves and their strengths and their passion and their purpose, and then the organization direction or needs. And when you can marry those two, it's a natural fit. So we can get into that when you start talking about succession planning and how you select people. But that return on luck is important. There's going to be serendipity, and the more you can kind of set it up, the more likely you're going to have that serendipity. Now let's take a look at those 3 questions that we're going to use in this. Because you're going to have a meeting with the employee. You're going to set it up something along these lines. We're a high-performing organization. We have aggressive growth goals. You've seen our vision. You've seen our mission. And we operate in a way that enables people to bring the best version of themselves to the table. But in order to do that, we have to take into consideration what their strengths are and their preferences. The reason that's important is because we're always going to be coming up with new things. We're always going to be working on new opportunities. And as a leader, one of my responsibilities is to organize the work. And when it comes to organizing the work, ideally, if I can align the work with somebody's interests, that's going to be a win-win for everybody. And so with that in mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions. It'll be an open dialogue, no wrong answers. None of this is going to be held against you. Feel free to speak freely. It's just for me to get a chance to understand what you like leaning into, what's a natural fit for you. I'm not always going to be able to do it, but when I can, it would be nice to organize the work around people's strengths. Let me just take a sidebar now. The reason I set it up that way and I emphasize it is because I have had employees who came from difficult environments, new employees that come from a difficult environment before, and they're actually thinking that this was some way to find out how to fire them, and it could have been internal. It could also be internal when people move from one leader to another. This is why it's so important to have a consistent metaphor, team versus family or political, because you have this one team that pits everybody against each other, and you have another team, too much servant leadership. When everybody's the same, you're not going to have those. But the reason I set it up that way is because I want the person to know that they're going to be safe. Be aware that you may have some people who are a little bit nervous about it. You may have to have 2 meetings, and if you read the book, Let Them. This is one of those things you let them, and then what are you going to do about it? You're not trying to fix them. If it takes me 2 hours to do this, I'm doing it because it's so important. So that was the setup. Basically, it's we need a high-performing environment because it's very competitive, and you've seen our vision. We want to win, and winning means achieving the vision. It's not about hurting anybody. It's not about a zero-sum game. This is about doing what we came here to do, and we're going to enjoy the process. And then you ask their permission to ask them some questions. And again, there's no wrong answer. So one is, if you had a magic wand and couldn't fail, what would you do professionally? And what you're doing here, obviously, is you're exploring what they value, their creative desires, but you're getting an understanding of what they want to do. This is the heart speaking, right? If they knew they couldn't fail, what would they do? That's coming from the heart. And you want to give them the space to do that. No judgment, just listening, learning, getting curious. And this is where you can start to explore some vulnerability, right? By asking, oh, tell me how that works. I've never done that before. Interesting. What makes that exciting for you? So you're going to spread this conversation out over 45 minutes to an hour. Once you've explored that one, you're going to have some hooks. And then the next question becomes, if you never had to work for money again, what would you spend your professional time doing? And this gets to the kind of work that they like. This is going to help you understand where the intrinsic motivation lies, right? Relatedness is seeing them. that their answer helps you see that, you know what, this is the kind of work that excites me, and the more I can be doing this. Now, what's cool about it is we don't need 100% alignment with the work and the task to have this kind of a result. We just need to have some overlap. 10% overlap could be enough. Feeling like they're at least moving forward in their own life, in terms of their own life priorities. But it is important and it gets to the relatedness piece because you see them, but it also gets to the confidence because you know that you can rely on them, and it's going to be easier for them to stay in a growth mindset when they're working on the things that they like. And none of this is manipulative. You are truly learning who they are so that in succession planning meetings, checkpoint meetings, performance review meetings, development plan, you have context for why they think the way they think. And rather than judging them, you'll be able to give them the space that they need to be themselves. And then the last question is, if you didn't have to work at all, how would you fuel your passion for life? Now, this is getting that blend of passion and purpose. You're getting both of these. If I can get a person working on things that they're passionate about and tie into their purpose, and by doing these two things, a little creativity, you can connect the dots. They took the job at your organization for a reason. There must be something in it that was intriguing for them, and what you're looking for, where I can find that overlap. The reason this is so powerful is because you are depositing into the emotional bank account. You're seeking first to understand before being understood. You're creating the psychological safety because you're letting them tell you things that they may have only told less than 10 people in their life. You're leaving the public persona and entering into the private persona. We're not going to get into the secret persona, and you have to be active about not letting them go there because you don't want to go there. You don't need to go into the secret persona. But you can think about asking the question why more than 2 or 3 times. You go, oh, why is that important to you? Oh, what made you come up with that idea? Oh, interesting. What made you choose that over this, right? You're asking variations of why multiple times to go a little bit deeper. But again, you don't need to go into the secret personas. The private one is where you want to get to. They're giving you the answers about their intrinsic motivation. When you do this well, you'll see them lighten up. They'll seem lighter, really getting excited about talking about what's really important to them. And the more you listen, and there's different models like ORS, there's open-ended questions, and then affirm them, and then reflect back to them what you've heard, right? And then kind of summarize. That's that OARS model, ORS. But the point is you're using these communication tools to enhance the conversation. It's not about manipulating. You're enhancing the conversation that you're having with this person. The other thing it does is it puts you in listening mode, and they will experience you listening to them maybe more than any other time in your working time together. So really lean into that and let them see that you do know how to listen. And what's interesting is they will learn this in that first week of working with you, preferably the first few days, and they will decide that you are a good listener. And what that's going to do is have them approach you with a more willing attitude, less likely to slip into fight or flight. And I would say start this right away. Even if you have been working with these people for years, just have a meeting and say, you know what, we haven't had a check-in conversation in a while, and I just want to get to know a little bit about you. I know some of the stuff that I've learned, but I'm not sure. And as we go into this next period, we're going to probably have to pivot more than we've expected or have done in the past. And these pivots create opportunities. They create opportunities for growth. They create opportunities to organize the work around what people like. And so I'm going to meet with all my direct reports just to have a similar conversation. And then you go back into it, and there's no right or wrong answer. And I would say have this conversation with all your direct reports at a minimum. After you've done it and you've experienced everybody, you can have a meeting and show this same slide and then have this same conversation and ask them to have it with their direct report. It is a game changer. The 1 hour investment will pay dividends over and over and over. And then when you start talking about development plans, there's a natural connection, right, between their strengths and then the development plans. There might be parts of development plans that one person has and another person doesn't, and it comes back to that first conversation. The next one we want to talk about is feedback. And on feedback, there's informal, there's formal, and there's urgent. We're going to use these regularly. It's important to make the distinction because informal feedback needs to be just that. It's informal, it's casual, it can go both ways. You can be asking them information about things. You could be getting feedback on something that you've done. You get feedback on whatever, right? And then formal, it's important to have these scheduled. So checkpoint meetings, performance reviews, succession planning meetings. I would not do these things haphazardly. One of the things I've observed is that leaders tend to be more formal with negative meetings and more informal with the positive meetings. So in other words, if they have an employee who's getting a good rating, they may not even schedule the performance review meeting. They'll just kind of tell the person in a passing conversation that they got a good rating or exceeds rating, and this is how much increase they're going to get, whatever it is. That is not the way to do that. These formal so again, checkpoints, performance reviews, succession planning, new assignments, all of these need a formal meeting because you're getting into something that's different. You're changing, and they have a role, and there's expectations. And this is why you have a development plan that spans over 2 years, because there should always be something to talk about. If you don't have anything to talk about, then you're not ready for the meeting. So go back to the drawing board and make sure that on your formal meeting, I don't care if the person is the star player, you still have a formal meeting with them because it gives you a chance to lean into the self-determination theory and talk about and foster autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then informal is, I would keep out some of the super gut-wrenching stuff. The informal is quick feedback, but it can be constructive feedback, and it can be positive. It could be either one, but just realize some feedback is better handled in a checkpoint meeting. And then the urgent is not one that I want to do very often. This is like, it has to happen. The timing is not right. The context is not right. But if we don't correct this now, we're going to have bigger problems. This could be somebody having a meeting with a group of new employees, an orientation meeting, and they say something wrong. You may have to do that urgent feedback on a break so they could correct it themselves, or depending on the setting, you may have to, with some elegance, intervene and correct what they're saying. So that urgent feedback, it takes some skill. But if you think about it from a development plan standpoint, I want all my leaders understanding how to do all three of these. I don't want them winging it. I don't want to find out after it's too late that they don't know how to do it. Now, with all of this feedback, we're leaning towards intrinsic motivation here. And when we're talking about intrinsic motivation, we now have we're tapping into the subconscious, their needs. We're tapping into the way habit formation happens. I'm hesitating to say dopamine and serotonin, but that's really what we're doing. If you look at it, dopamine makes us anticipate some positive thing that's coming. The serotonin goes up when we feel one up, when we're one up above, and it makes us feel the serotonin goes down when we've been one upped. So you want to create this environment where people are able to get the positive serotonin hits, and they're able to get the natural motivation that comes from dopamine. We're going to talk about red, blue, and white language. The objective here is that we talk about the observable behavior. We don't want to be talking about generalities here. We want to tie observable behavior, because if we don't do observable behavior, the feedback gets attached to me as the leader instead of the actual task or the behavior that they did. What we don't want is the red language. In the red language, it's things like, hey, you did a good job, or yeah, you're so motivated, or you're a great employee, you're a great team member. Those words, while it's positive motivation, it attached the good feelings to me as the leader. So when I'm gone, They're just doing whatever. When I show up, they start doing what they think is what caused me to say they're doing a good job, or they're a good employee, or a great job today. By giving observable behavior, you're describing what they did, and that actually gets into habit formation. Remember, the subconscious is processing 11 million bits per second, and it's always trying to figure out what should I be doing, what's right, and it's looking for how they should behave. It's a tribal thing, right? They want to know what they should be doing. So if I don't give them that, they're going to make it up. And if they're making it up, they're going to be attaching it to me rather than the specific behavior. So that it goes more like, I like the way you handle that client today. You know, they were starting to get a little bit tense, and you decided that you should take a break. They brought in another team member to help diffuse the situation. Whatever it is, you describe what they did, and that's reinforcing them to do more of that. When you're giving feedback, understand that what you're doing is setting conditioning. Now, either you're setting conditioning intentionally, or it's just haphazardly. And if it's haphazardly, you're not moving the action towards your vision. So what you want to do is be focused on observable behavior. What did they actually do in the situation? It goes both ways. It goes in positive and it goes in negative, right? So I could describe that instead of saying they're a bad employee, you might say, 3 times this week we missed deadlines. Now here's what happened on this first deadline, and then you describe it. You're not saying they're a bad employee. You're saying we missed a deadline, and you're describing the impact of that deadline, etc. And then white language is what's not there. So you want to avoid language that gets into you don't do this, you never do that. That doesn't tell them how to improve. Common thinking or traditional thinking says that by the time people are using white language when they're describing what somebody's not doing, the relationship is broken down. And it makes sense because there's hundreds of things that a person is not doing in any given moment. And if we're only focused on what they're not doing, we're not focusing on what they are doing. So blue language not only focuses on what they're doing, it's putting it into words and describing it in such a way that it paints a word picture for them. And now the dopamine and serotonin goes to work at forming that habit because you've given them the positive feedback. So red, white, and blue language. And this is consistent with, you'll find this through the threads and multipliers, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This continues on. It's all your communication best practices tie back to this. But you want to avoid, even when it's good, you want to avoid just the plain old red adjectives type language. Great job. It doesn't mean you can't ever say good job, but I'm come up with the reason why you're saying good job. Don't just say good job. Man, you did a good job today. The reason I'm saying that, among several things, but one of them is that you did boom, 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 boom. Whatever it is, paint a word picture, because that's how the subconscious is going to take it in. And then the subconscious starts to move synapse, neurotransmitter, towards doing that behavior again. Now, as the leader, when you're not there, they are already doing what they should be doing. They know they don't have to be told what to do, and they don't need your presence to be doing it. So that's the feedback, informal, formal, and urgent. And this is an example of a skill that leaders should have. I would want my leaders knowing the differences of formal, informal, and urgent feedback, and then observing them. It's not hard to observe them. You just set up a meeting where you're shadowing them or watching them give the feedback. And then you can model the red, white, and blue language, but also have a little workshop on it, or just catch them with using informal feedback. When they've given somebody some feedback, you can ask them, let's turn that into blue language. What would it be from a blue language standpoint? And then you yourself can model it. I would say don't underestimate the power of that, because it gets very much to the relatedness part of self-determination theory. That relatedness part means that you see them. You can't have blue language if you don't see them. And giving that red language, and certainly white language, can be done without seeing them. And this is, people walk around not feeling seen, and it's a big hit on the intrinsic motivation. So I talked about self-regulation, and as leaders, we have to know when we're being triggered. We have to know when we're starting to feel that charge, and we have to be able to self-regulate. Self-regulation is not about suppressing the emotion or the fight or flight. It's about managing one so that we prevent it from happening, And maybe we excuse ourselves from a particular situation before it manifests. The idea is having that self-awareness, because if you go into fight or flight mode and you're interacting with an employee, you run the risk of just creating more of that. They're gonna feel tense. They're gonna fall into fight or flight, and now you have two people on edge. And we've seen this happen, right? I mean, you've probably been in situations where somebody gives you bad news and you don't mean to, but you attack the messenger. They're just bringing you the bad news. They had nothing to do with it, but you attack them, and it's just a reaction. It's that fight or flight reaction that comes out. And it is different. You can actually tell when it's a subconscious survival response versus a conscious thought. Obviously, you can tell. You want to notice that when it's coming up. Be willing to say, I want to be able to give this full attention. Why don't we get together in 30 minutes or, at 2:30 and we'll, go to the cafeteria or something, or sit down and have some coffee. I want to dig more into this. Whatever it is, delay it. Remember, I've talked before about in that stimulus response, which happens in a half of a second, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to make a decision right after that half second. How are we going to respond, and then what's the decision? We could do it, which is do something, react, whatever. Delay it, and that's what I'm talking about here. Dump it. We're not going to deal with it at all. It could be something, wow, that's not a priority, and now we're not even going to worry about it. Thank you for bringing me the information. Or you can delegate it. Yeah, that's important. And then you're going to give it to somebody else, or you're going to have them go talk to somebody else, whatever that is. But do it, delay it, delegate it, dump it. And in this case, I'm talking about you have the opportunity to delay something if you're feeling a charge. So the leaders are responsible for the self-regulation, and that self-regulation is going to enable them to be in higher order thinking. So the definition of higher order thinking involves cognitive processes that are more complex than simply recalling information. It typically includes skills such as analysis, synthesis, evaluation, problem solving, and critical thinking. What this slide is not saying is that it's the opposite of a survival response. That's what we want to be aware of. This is what we want. We don't want the survival response. And leaders have to have enough agency and personal leadership that they can manage those two. And again, it's not about suppressing the fight or flight. It's about preventing the fight or flight in the first place through self-regulation. And then when the fight or flight gets through anyway, using tools like emotion regulation to allow that emotion to pass through, but also giving yourself the space to make sure you get back to stasis before you have the interaction with the employee. You don't have to, just because you can say it now doesn't mean you should say it now, is what we're talking about. So you see on there critical thinking. I would say take a screenshot of that, and then I want to look at these definitions, because critical thinking, we use critical thinking often, and we talk about critical thinking, and we know people who do search and they don't use critical thinking. People fall into conspiracy theories because they don't use critical thinking. And I want to make a distinction between critical thinking, which is important, and what I'll talk about next. So critical thinking is the broad ability to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information to form reasoned judgments or conclusions. It involves a set of cognitive skills and dispositions used to process information, challenge assumptions, and make decisions. Key components of critical thinking include questioning assumptions, evaluating evidence, considering multiple perspectives, drawing conclusions. Again, these are skills that leaders should have. They should be able to demonstrate them. And in the development plan, the way the development plan might work with the leader is these are expectations you have, and you might have a checklist of things you want to go down. And as you interact with them, you're checking off. Once you've observed that they can do it, you're checking them off. It may not mean that you're developing them and teaching them how to do critical thinking. If they already have the skill, fine. You just have to observe it, and then you've checked off that you've observed it. You may have a conversation about it. For new employees, maybe there is a class that you have, or that you have some self-study. There's enough self-study material. You can create a course on using artificial intelligence. You can have them read a book. There's many ways. We'll talk about development plans in a little more detail next week. But I wanted to make this distinction between critical thinking, which is a skill and should be a skill for all the leaders and employees, everybody on the team. And then for my leaders, I also want first principles thinking. So first principles thinking is a problem-solving approach that involves breaking down complex problems or ideas into their most basic and fundamental truths. those that are self-evident and indisputable, and then building up from there to find insights or solutions. It's a way of thinking that discards assumptions, starting from scratch and focusing on what is absolutely true in that situation. So first principle thinking is a specific methodology. It forces you to break things down to the most basic fundamental truths and rebuild. The reason I'm pointing this out is because a person can use critical thinking and still fall into some traps. But by demanding, when I say demand, it's an expectation that you have for your leaders to use first principles thinking. You know that they're uncovering the different stones. There's a term, MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. It's not necessarily tied to first principles thinking, but it's something to think about. Mutually exclusive, MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. And these are things that you can have expectations for your leaders. And again, an observation. I want to make sure that I have observed them doing this. So I covered 3 of them today. We talked about the onboarding, we talked about feedback, and we talked about the self-regulation for leaders. These are skills that you can start talking about today. Certainly I would do the onboarding with everybody, and I would start providing feedback using blue language. It's tricky to get to make it comfortable, and it's going to be a little bit clunky at first, but it's language. You're just going to put a higher demand on yourself so that you don't just say good job. You actually ask yourself, why am I saying they did a good job? You can use this with family members. You can use it friend groups informally. It's not just work. It's how people are seen. It's the relatedness piece. And then the self-regulation and using critical thinking and first principles thinking as an outcome of that self-regulation, because you can't do critical thinking and first principles thinking if you're in fight or flight. So we want to make sure that leaders have the ability to create that space, and they may not always be able to, as I said, not have the fight or flight, but they can certainly excuse themselves and come back to the topic a little bit later on. Right? I don't think there's very many things that are super urgent that has to be done right then, but if it does, you do the best you can, focus on a short-term fix, try to get out of the pain, and then come back with a better design. That's the one thing I didn't talk about with the problem-solving model, is that if it's really urgent or something that's high severity and high probability that this is going to be a big problem, you may want to put in a short-term fix because it helps everybody relax and calm down a bit. All right, so that's it. We'll talk next week about how do you build the development plans. We'll see you. Remember, we're also doing the forums at 7:00 a.m. Pacific time on Monday. And we'll be talking about how to apply these different things I introduce into your organization. All right, we'll see you.